Good afternoon. I'm John Wasileski, and I want to welcome you all to OceanView at Falmouth, and many of you are residents at OceanView at Falmouth, and I'm very pleased to be happy to host this forum today and introduce to you Jennifer Rooks after I give a brief introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you for coming. So, I think we should take control of our energy future, don't you? And I think we should do things that are more sustainable, that are green, that allow for secure access for the public and everyone, and price conscious. We should all be price conscious. These are all key considerations that we believe in at OceanView and we're working on very strongly. OceanView, as you just saw in our video, is a full-service retirement community conceived almost 35 years ago, providing for a continuum of care for those over 55 years of age. OceanView consists of homes, apartments, and service packages designed to accommodate those wishing for an easier maintenance-free lifestyle right through the time when all their services may be needed through the end of one's life. Planning at OceanView. You may not think that people plan to move to OceanView, but they do. Many of them plan for many, many years or decades. Most residents at OceanView are planners, so the concept today that we're talking about planning and talking about control of our energy future, they're natural for a forum on energy today, and many of the residents are, of course, interested in this. These concepts we employ at OceanView, such as smart growth. When OceanView was first, we located its site, we wanted to locate it on existing water, sewer, and infrastructure, so that we weren't building in the middle of a farmland where we had to extend utility lines miles and eat up unnecessary farmland. This was already in a designated area to be built on in Falmouth, and it was wooded, yes it was. However, it is on existing utilities, and that is called today, the euphemism is called smart growth. And it's a big thing, but of course we were doing it 35 years ago. We're located in the heart of Falmouth, now have public transportation even. And as you can see by the great Route 1 revitalization, the town of Falmouth is following suit with even beautifying the town. We also have energy efficient homes and apartments. Every time we renovate a home or apartment, we put in the highest energy efficiency that we can with windows and also insulation and the like. And we have almost a net zero building in our Blueberry Commons buildings and also all our cottages that we recently built at Schoolhouse. Solar generated electricity. For every new house that we're building at Schoolhouse Cottages, phases 1 through 4, everyone will have solar photovoltaic. Many of them have their own solar hot water as well, and they also have their own emergency generators. As well as we're utilizing efficient fossil fuels, which contribute the least amount of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere today. It's not the ideal solution. The ideal solution, Tony and the other panelists will be talking about, is to go to a greener future, but it's a bridge, as lots of people call, towards that green future. And our campus, as I said, has many emergency generators, and our goal is to have 100% emergency generation throughout the entire campus by the end of this year. We also are working on a dual fuel system. And we had hoped to have Kurt Adams, the newly elected, or I should say appointed president of Summit Natural Gas here. But it's actually Kurt's idea, and I will give him credit for this. Natural gas is on Route 1 and in Falmouth, and they're hoping to bring it to this part of Falmouth. But they need to get across 295 and the railroad track and ultimately Middle Road to get here. We pledged to be an anchor tenant, just like an anchor tenant in a shopping mall, to buy a large amount of natural gas to bring them across 295. Now, once that pipe is laid and connected into the OceanView pipeline, all of our propane tanks serviced by and put in by Dead River, and Claudette Townsend will be talking about that today, and other things, all those propane pipelines can be utilized for natural gas. Now, why would we do that? Well, we're doing that because it makes good economic sense. Maybe the price of natural gas is high one year and we want to switch to propane. We could do that. Maybe the price is high for the other way around. We want to switch, we could do that. But I also want to do that for access and security. You've heard about terrorist attacks. You've heard about ice storms. Anybody living in Maine during 1998 remembers the infamous January 1998 ice storm. For 6 long days, propane trucks were not allowed on the Massachusetts Turnpike. And of course, they were all filled in New York State by Albany, in a town called Selkirk, and they were not allowed to travel on the interstate to Maine. That created incredible shortage, only bridged in an emergency by extra railway cars that came through Lake Megantic through Bangor. Now, as we know, there are no more railway cars transporting volatile fuel along those train tracks. So we're relying totally for not only for ship transport, but also road transport. So if there was an interruption in service, natural gas is here by pipeline and the like. So it gives us more control as well. So the dual system makes a lot of sense to us. 2 books I'd like to put in your mind to think about for the future in reading. One of which, if everyone has watched ABC News over the years, you remember a gentleman by the name of Ted Koppel, and he's now on PBS and other shows. He recently authored a book called Lights Out, talking about the vulnerability of our electricity grid in this country and alike. And that's one reason why we wanted to have emergency generators that could run off-peak, but also provide energy for the homes of our residents that are vulnerable, as well as and for the useful life of their homes while they're here. The second one is called Mid-Course Correction. And Mid-Course Correction may be a little bit lesser known book, but it's by a gentleman by the name of Ray Anderson. And Ray Anderson in the Guilford Industries story, unfortunately Guilford Industries is no longer in the state of Maine, but they manufactured carpet for many, many years. And Ray Anderson speaks about his book, and he speaks about his experience, and he describes his responsibility as a corporate citizen, as well as an individual, in all everyday citizens at home and in the boardroom by this way. He says we should make decisions about the future that is best for your unborn grandson or granddaughter in the empty chair at the end of the table. Now, resonates with me because I happen to have my son Chris at the end of the room. Chris, raise your hand. Chris is married, and well, he's going to be having a baby real soon. And so I'm going to be a grandfather, believe it or not. Well, I should be making decisions, if you think about that, for that grandson or granddaughter or future grandsons and granddaughter, i.e. the next generation on, not just my generation and short-sighted. So I shouldn't be thinking about the lowest possible cost. I should be thinking about the life cycle cost, the 40-year, the 50-year cost, the CO2 emission costs, and other things while we make decisions. So without much more ado, welcome to OceanView, Lunt Auditorium, and I want to introduce to you Jennifer Rooks, well-esteemed host of many programs at MPBN, who we have a common friend that unfortunately is no longer with us, Jim Dow, who used to be president of Bat Savings and then Maine Public Broadcasting, who hired Jennifer and also gave me my first bank loan for OceanView in 1990, believe it or not. So thank you, Jennifer. Good luck.
This is a mic check. Can you hear me all right if I use this microphone? Is that all right? Yeah, great. Okay. Just raise your hand and let me know if there's a problem. I can always speak more loudly. You can just ask my children about that. And it's interesting, John, that you mentioned the Ted Koppel book. We had Ted Koppel call into Maine Calling a couple months ago and talked about this very issue and the vulnerability of our electrical grid, as well as just the vulnerability of cyber attack and some of the good reasons people might have to if they're not lucky enough to live someplace like this, buy a generator or put aside some money and some water and maybe some food that's non-perishable. So it's interesting that you brought up that book today, John. I thought that maybe a great way to start the panel discussion today was to just hear a little bit from each of the people on the panel, have them say what their organization is and why they're interested in the future of energy. Does that sound like a good idea to you? And I thought, Claudette, it was interesting to me. I think many people associate Dead River with oil. John gave a little bit of a tip about why you might be here today. It has something to do with propane and natural gas, but why don't you talk about Dead River and why you're here on a panel looking at energy future?
Sure. All right, so I'm the Director of New Products and Services at Dead River Company, and We're known as a liquid fuels company, but of course we're interested in all energy opportunities to help consumers in the future. We've sold electricity, we offer compressed natural gas, and of course you're familiar with the propane that you use here at OceanView. And so we're always sort of keeping an eye to what's going to happen in the future, and how can we help consumers in whatever it is that their energy goals are. Let's see, what else would you like to know about Dead River Company Idea?
Is that enough?
Most people know a fair amount, I think,
Right.
about us as an organization. So, this woman.
I just would like a little louder.
Oh, I'm
A little
sorry.
louder, okay, great. So just maybe hold that a little closer to your mouth. And-
Sure.
And Fortunat Mueller is with Revision. I know that Revision Energy is really well known for solar installations, but I know that there's a division of your company that works on other kind of energy as well. So if you can just tell us a little bit about Revision Energy. And you're the largest
We are, here in Maine, yes.
in Maine, right?
Well, thanks, Jennifer, and I don't know where John went, but thank you, John, for hosting this. We're really delighted to be a part of it. We've had the opportunity to work here with John and his staff at OceanView for over 10 years on solar projects and other projects of all kinds, so we're really glad to be a part of this. My name is Fortunat Mueller. Our business is called, as Jennifer said, Revision Energy. And our primary business is the design and installation of solar and solar hot water systems throughout Maine and New Hampshire and northern New England. Our business is driven by the mission to transition New England from extractive, polluting fossil fuels to sustainable, renewable energy over time. And we are trying to do that across all aspects of our economy, not just the electricity grid. So in addition to solar stuff that Jennifer mentioned, we provide efficient electric-based heating solutions like heat pumps and heat pump water heaters paired with renewable energy in order to be able to displace a greater chunk of your fossil fuel footprint. Likewise, we are doing more and more with electric vehicle charging infrastructure because in Maine, transportation accounts for a huge fraction of our total fossil fuel consumption and carbon emissions. And so we're sort of trying to attack this problem from every possible angle.
All right. Naomi Beal, what is passivhaus? And did I pronounce it correctly?
You did. Passivhaus is a standard that comes from Germany, actually. It's just a construction standard that is very precise but very simple. It has energy requirements that are tiny, and it's basically 3 standards. It has to have air tightness, energy usage, and heat, specifically heat usage.
So as your organization, do you build homes or do you go in and evaluate homes that are built? What is passivhaus do?
Passivhaus Maine is the total name of our organization, and we're part of a network nationally and internationally that promote high performance building. So we work with architects and engineers and builders and homeowners or developers to help them build and construct the most efficient building they possibly can.
All right, and Tony Buxton, I've interviewed you several times. Here today, what is your role in looking toward Maine's energy future?
Well, I'm here as a candidate to come live here. In fact, I told my wife where I was going, and she said, "Well, take your bag."
Uh-oh.
Hello. I've been hacked. Anyway, my wife said, "Why don't you take your bag and just stay there for a while and see how you like it?" Anyway, I'm an attorney who chairs a group of energy lawyers in a firm of about 100 lawyers, and we focus on representing large energy consumers, power plant developers, solar developers, wind developers, and also people who try to make the grid more efficient, like Fortunat, by integrating new technologies and having those technologies be responsive to what you need as consumers. There are some exciting things happening in the electric grid, and we're privileged to provide legal services to some of the people who do that.
All right. So I guess the first big question that I'd like all of you to look at is, you all have a goal of creating a different kind of energy future for the country, but there are obstacles as well as opportunities. And And maybe I'll start with you, Fortunat, because I know something that really has affected your industry is very much in the news right now. Can you talk about how the solar bill that the governor vetoed affects your industry and what you see happening going forward after that?
Sure.
And maybe, would you guys like to him explain what just happened a little bit?
Right.
Yeah, so why don't you explain? It was a bill that was a coalition of people came together.
Sure, so I'll try not to consume the whole hour that I'm talking about this one topic, so feel free to cut me off. In Maine, like in lots of places around the country, as Tony referenced, there's lots of interesting conversations happening about what should the future of the electric grid look like. And a lot of these conversations are happening around the concept of distributed solar, so sort of your right to put solar on your own roof. But really that is sort of just the camel's nose under the tent. The bigger question is, you know, how do we make the grid responsive in the 21st century so that it serves customers better and enables energy choice for consumers. Specifically here in Maine, as Jennifer mentioned, a broad coalition of parties, actually a sort of surprisingly broad coalition of parties, including solar advocates, solar installers like ourselves, environmental groups, both of the state's regulated utilities, the state's public advocate, work together to develop a framework to sort of encourage solar adoption in a way that is cost neutral or actually saves all ratepayers in Maine money. That became a bill in this last session, which ultimately was unsuccessful because the legislature was unable to override the governor's veto of that bill. So the result of that is that the policy in Maine today is the same as it was 6 months ago, but there is some market uncertainty related to the fact that the Public Utilities Commission is reviewing currently the rules related to net metering, which is the policy that exists today. So there's a little bit of market uncertainty because nobody really knows what they're going to do. We hope they will do something good, but they may do something bad.
Fortunat, what do you believe is the potential for solar power? What percentage of the energy mix, when we're talking about the electrical grid, would be possible, and what would be a good number that is actually achievable?
Yeah, so a decade or two ago, I think a lot of people would have thought, if we can get to 1 or 2% solar, that would be delightful. As solar technology has improved and as costs have come down, there's reason to believe we ought to be quite a bit more ambitious than that. Our feeling is that the end game has to be an economy that runs entirely on renewables in order to be sustainable over the long term. And that doesn't mean entirely on solar, that just means entirely on renewables. And a fellow from Stanford University, Professor Mark Jacobson, has done a really interesting series of work on this state by state, figuring out how each state can get to 100% renewables by 2050 and what the appropriate mix is based on the resources that exist there. And I don't know the numbers for Maine off the top of my head, but I think solar ends up in sort of the low 20s, and wind, so it's mostly wind, water, and solar, basically the three major technologies. And I frankly think 2050 is roughly the right timeline. It's pretty ambitious, but I think we ought to be shooting for that.
Okay, so that's a great segue to you, Claudette. By 2050, what would you like to see as the ideal energy mix, and what are some of the obstacles or opportunities? What needs to happen for us to get there?
Sure. So my vision, based on my experiences in the past, about what the energy mix will look like in the future is just very diversified. I think that's what's happening is more and more there are lots of choices out there. And interestingly, what we're seeing is that consumers are really finding ways to have diverse choices in their own homes. John spoke about having a dual fuel situation here. There are dual and multi-fuel situations going on. I think that's going to continue. The other thing that we're seeing happen is people are just using less. Interestingly, when you think about the market share for propane and heating oil in the state of Maine, right now, propane is about 8% of the consumption, and heating oil is about 67%, which may sound like a lot for heating oil. However, heating oil has actually gone down 43% since 2004, so over 11 years. And that 43%, some of that is about diversification, and a lot of it's about efficiency. So thinking like passive house there. And we're a fan of using less, whatever it is, and leaving yourself the options of having multiple choices in your home.
Looking at obstacles, though, I think John mentioned that to bring a certain kind of pipeline here, that's a very tangible problem, that we have to cross a railroad track, that we have to go across a major road. Are these kind of infrastructure problems the biggest obstacle to achieving a better energy mix, or is it something else?
So I think I think that's true for any investment that you're looking at in your life, whatever it is. If you have a situation A and you're looking at situation B, what does it take to get there, and what's the benefit of that? I actually, interestingly, think one of the big challenges that we face is consumers understanding those choices today, what they look like in the future, what impacts how it looks today and how it might look in the future. Consumers, commercial consumers, policymakers, we have some great people in Augusta trying to do good things, but they only have a certain breadth of experience, and that's a challenge, understanding it all and making sense of it.
Tony Buxton, where do we need to be headed, and what's in our way?
Wow, that's a pretty big question.
I have confidence you can answer.
I was thinking, Jennifer, that in 2050 we'll all be dead, but I would hope those who are extant in 2050 would look back and say, the people of Maine, starting in 2013-ish, really bit the bullet. They really got it. And despite their differences, they were able to come together and not hope for the future, but take steps to actually make it happen in the near present. And this gathering and this building and this complex are, in a sense, a metaphor for our society. They show what a leader can do to make things happen in a way that they don't have to happen in, and to make a dramatic difference in people's lives. And I applaud John and his team for that. Simply said, Jennifer, what I advocate personally and on behalf of some of my clients is that we should move very rapidly to the largely renewable future that Fortunat and others have mentioned. And we need to do that by first lowering our cost of energy a little bit and taking part of the savings and putting it toward renewables. So we directly subsidize them with foreknowledge that we have to do that to avoid the catastrophic climate change problems that we're confronting. And the way we do that is by ensuring we have enough natural gas pipeline capacity to meet our heating needs in winter, get the gas to places like this, and use that as the bridge that John mentioned. There are those who disagree, but these scholarly studies are very positive on this with increasing frequency. And it doesn't mean that we're locking ourselves into gas. In fact, 2 years ago we used 52% of our kilowatt hours were gas. This past year they were 46. I believe they can get down into the 30s and therefore get us off oil. Claudette mentioned our reliance on oil. It is a lot less than it used to be. It just happens to be about it is the very highest in the continental United States, with the exception obviously of Alaska and Hawaii. And the price for that is bad health, high costs, uncertainty on foreign events, and the failure to be efficient in our energy consumption. So I'd like to see us decide to do it, to build a base, to make the transition and get there as rapidly as we can without shutting down our mills, without getting outcompeted by other regions. One final fact, and I'll stop. Natural gas in the Marcellus Shale, beginning in Albany, New York, and stretching all the way to Ohio and down into West Virginia, is coming out of the ground over the last 2 years at a price which, if you converted it in BTUs, take it to BTUs and convert it to BTUs to gasoline, would put gasoline in the tank of your car at 12 to 17 cents a gallon. And we are telling our citizens they can't have that when everybody else in the country can have it. And it's hollowing out our manufacturing business, diminishing the efficiency of our utilities and our society, and it's holding us back from getting to renewables, in my view.
You say rapidly. How rapidly does this need to happen, and how rapidly can it happen?
We could make a decision. In fact, the decision will come out of Augusta today, a recommended decision by the PUC staff on a gas pipeline matter. We'll see what they decide. I'm worried. We could have pipelines. Well, pipelines are being built right now. That's the first thing. That's the good news. To the Marcellus Shale. But we need more capacity, and pipelines are very controversial. People don't like to have them in their neighborhood. And people don't like change. But we could have more pipelines substantially in operation by 2019, 2020. And at the same time, we'll be doing a lot more solar through Fortunat and others. We'll be doing a lot more wind through wind developers. And when that all comes on, when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, we'll be able to rely not on oil as we have historically for power, but on natural gas, which is 2/3, well, actually it was 1/2 the CO2, and far less of the pollutants of oil and coal. So that transition can be really in full. I think by 2020, 2025, a lot more of Maine and New England is going to look like this facility than it does now.
And Naomi, I'll get to you in just a second, but a couple more questions for you, Tony. The first is there less appetite for natural gas projects as the cost of oil has been lower in the last few years?
There's no question that's true. That's particularly true for homeowners who have to invest $5,000 to $10,000 to $15,000 to take out grandma's old furnace that they inherited in the house and take out the asbestos. It's a nightmare in a lot of Maine cellars. But there are ways to help with that. There are subsidies. Kurt Adams was mentioned with Summit Gas. They give a subsidy. The state Efficiency Maine Trust gives a subsidy. However, as the price of price of oil has fallen, so has the price of gas. And it's not a one-to-one reduction, but that price that I mentioned of natural gas reflects the low price of oil. Right now, oil is still twice as expensive as natural gas if you have access to both.
And what about people's concerns, legitimate concerns about the environmental record of the fracking industry?
It's a classic example of the maturation of an industry. The first people in are wildcatters, no matter if they're in gas or building shopping centers, right? They want to get in, make a buck, and leave. The people who buy those facilities, who endure, who have to live in the community, run good operations. And the fracking business, the business of cracking rocks and extracting gas has gotten much, much better. In fact, the emissions rate in the Marcellus Shale is 0.3% compared to 3% in oil extraction, roughly 3%. And we can do even better. It's a controllable phenomenon. Everything about energy requires something to be changed in its form. And that's a fact of our energy lives.
All right, Naomi, I promised. Why don't you answer that original question if you can? What would you like to see, whether it's 20 years, 30 years, 40 years from here, where we're getting our energy and what kind of mix we're going to see here in Maine?
Yeah, so passivhaus Maine and passivhaus in general is about efficiency first. So even to use that example of getting the natural gas across the highway and the railroad track, a specific example is the Friends School of Portland is a new structure on Route 1 in Cumberland, just on the Cumberland-Falmouth line. And that is a brand new building. A couple years ago, we had to make a decision. If we wanted to actually connect to the natural gas line that is on Route 1, and the school, because of the way it's designed, passed altogether on getting natural gas, there's no reason the building doesn't need it. It is net zero with solar panels as our main power source. So those buildings can be made now in the short term. When we get to 2020, 2050, I would really expect to see all of our buildings built to net zero standard through efficient passive house or whatever high performance standard you're going to have, complemented by some type of renewable. Solar is easy. I'm not saying we can get rid of fossil fuels. I'm not sure we can, but in terms of housing, that can be done very soon.
All right, and one of the big debates going on is how much of a role government has in moving us to a different kind of energy future. I mean, there are layers of this. Different people in government think a different kind of energy. For the governor is a big advocate of hydropower and you know, buying energy from Canada where they have the big hydroelectric dams. You all have different ideas. How much of this should be market-based and how much should be government policy-based? And if, you know, I don't really care who goes first. Who has the strongest feeling about that? Go ahead, Claudette.
So my opinion about that is that where we have shared infrastructure, like our electric grid, we need a government to help regulate that, to make sure it runs effectively, so that the lights go on when we want them to and expect them to. I think that's a great place for the government to help us. Otherwise, where people are making individual choices, I'm a free market fan myself.
And it might surprise some of you to hear that I mostly agree with that position. You know, a decade ago, solar really needed government support in order to be cost effective. Today, mostly what it needs is fair access to be cost effective. Solar today is competitive with every possible fuel source, really all over the US. And the challenge, of course, is that our electricity markets are not free markets inherently, right? 100 years ago, we made a deal with the utilities that if they would build power lines all over the state, we would grant them a monopoly to serve those customers. That was a pretty good deal at the time for us. We got reasonably reliable electricity throughout the state. It was a good deal for them. They got to build power lines and make a guaranteed return on their investment. Today, the situation is different. We no longer have load growth, electricity load growth in the state, and so the utilities no longer need to build power lines. Power lines, to some degree, building power infrastructure is sort of a natural monopoly, right? It doesn't make sense to have two companies building power lines down the street. And so it made sense to grant somebody a monopoly to do that in exchange for regulation. Today, the problems we have with the electric grid are not best solved by more power lines. They're best solved by a variety of resources and ideas, some of which Tony represents. You know, solar and distributed generation are one, but so are smart thermostats and smart water heaters, demand response and batteries and a bunch of other things. And frankly, those are not natural monopolies. It doesn't make any sense to say the utilities can do that better than anybody else. In fact, there's pretty good evidence that the utilities probably don't do that better than everybody else. And so I think the central challenge now is to figure out how to open up those markets to competitive pressures. But I mean, it's hard to imagine Ma Bell having come up with Netflix or YouTube, right? So and it's the same sort of idea. The next idea in energy efficiency and DERs is not likely to come from the utilities. Right now, the utilities, but monopolies have never voluntarily ceded their monopoly. And so that is where public policy is necessary. They do a very good job defending their monopoly through the regulatory process and through the political process, and I think we collectively need to do a good job of convincing policymakers and regulators that the people's interest is in having competition in those spaces. And that is, I mentioned before, I feel like the solar conversations are sort of the tip of the spear in a much bigger conversation about what does the 21st century electric grid look like and how does it serve consumers effectively. And so that's why I feel so passionate about getting these questions right. I mean, also because I would like to keep all of our folks employed and keep building solar in Maine. But in a bigger picture, it's really important to get the structure right because these are big, challenging questions over the next several decades.
In terms of the efficiency and individual structure, I would love to see from our government just setting an example in our own municipal buildings at the state level and at our town level to spend as much attention to our public libraries and fire departments and town halls, setting the example for others to follow. I don't know, there are tons of incentives that I think would be great in terms of insulation, but if even our own government would do the right thing by our own buildings, I think that'd be a huge start.
Naomi, do you think what's going on now as far as incentives for people to winterize their homes are enough to provide meaningful change?
No, I think they're baby steps. I think giving a 2,000, 3,000 square foot home $10,000 to air seal is helpful, but it's not a great answer to really upping our efficiency and minimizing our fuel needs.
What would be more effective, do you believe?
What's that?
Knocking the house down.
I mean, that's a tough thing to say, but I think there are instances in which that's not unreasonable. I'm not exactly sure. We've been grappling with that. Existing structures for passivhaus standard, it's easy to do a new building to passivhaus standard. It is actually easy. Every building should be built that way. Retrofits are 600,000 existing units right now are hard, and as you say, every basement is a nightmare, and but $10,000 to a single house is it's a half answer, and I think that is a problem that we should grapple with a little more deeply. I think it would be helpful for our government to say reducing our carbon footprint is a priority. I think that just that leadership.
Fortunat, you want to jump in?
I was going to say on the question of sort of incentives for weatherization specifically, the design of incentive programs is challenging, but I think one of the places where maybe Efficiency Maine has come up short at times is it's easy to incentivize sort of the first little bit of action, but it actually is problematic when you design a system that creates incentives to do a little bit of work, because then homeowners think they're done. And I already weatherized my house, even though I got a lot of work left to do. And so my feeling is that the incentives ought to actually be more generous the deeper you go, because that's where you need the help, and that's what we actually need people to do. There's sort of a little bit of a cream skimming problem in some of the incentive structures that exist today.
All right, Tony, your turn.
Maine has the oldest housing stock in the nation, which is fitting because the people in it are the oldest in the nation. When you think about it. No offense to anybody out there. You're in new places. We put about $1 billion a year in New England into energy efficiency throughout the states. It's very different. Maine is just catching up now to what a couple of other states are doing. That compares to our spending $5 billion to $10 billion on actually purchasing electricity in a given year, depending on what the weather is. So we are investing a lot of money in efficiency, but the big problem that you've highlighted is the insulation of homes, the replacement of windows and doors, and so on, because that gets really expensive, particularly with a good-sized house. To get to your question about what government should do, the point that Fortunat makes is the correct point. With the digital age, we have the ability to update the grid so it does only what we ask it to do, as opposed to being able to do as much as anybody could ever want at any given instant. Now think about the difference there. Would you run a business to be able to serve everyone in Maine all at once if they happen to show up at your door? Or would you design it so that you could serve what you expected to be the demand in a given hour? The's no question what you would do. Our grid and its owners make a lot of money doing it the old-fashioned way, and we have to change that by using the digital technology that is now available, whether it's Nest thermostats in your home that sense whether you're in the home or not, or your heater which senses whether you're in the room, and giving you what you need, not what you don't need, will save a lot in actual fuel use, will diminish our carbon footprint, and will save vast amounts of money. And right now, there are people making a lot of money by denying individual citizens the mechanisms to make that choice. And what government has to do is force the utilities and other major enterprises to allow consumers to make those choices.
Are there any places, in your view, Tony, where the utility is smarter than our utility here in New England? Where the electricity usage on the grid is more targeted and more efficient?
Well, there are many examples worldwide, but I want to say Maine's utilities are relatively smart, but nonetheless, we all working with them do some things that aren't so smart. For example, Maine has almost entirely what are called smart meters, which have the capacity, if properly programmed, to price electricity in very short periods of time, 5 minutes at a time or less. Except that when they were installed, they weren't programmed to do that. Now that's just dumb. You know, that's a mistake we all made, and I can claim some, negligence in the process myself. And we have a largely robust grid, but we didn't perfect it in terms of moving power from renewable sources out of Maine, which we should have. So we're doing fairly well here. We can do a lot better. The rest of New England is not doing as well as we are, with the possible exception of Vermont, in terms of a smart grid. Fortunat probably knows much more about this than I do.
I was just going to say, I think the problem is not that the utilities are insufficiently smart. They're very smart. The problem is their incentives are generally in the wrong direction. The utilities, as Tony alluded to, make very good money building power lines. They make their best money building power lines. And so all their incentive is to argue that we need more power lines. The job, in my view, the job of the regulators is to figure out how they can make, I don't begrudge CMP the right to make a profit on their investments. That feels like an appropriate thing to do, but they ought to be investing in a way that is beneficial for all of us for the long term. And today that is no longer building more power lines, it's building more intelligence into the system and more resilience into the system.
All right, I just looked at my watch, it's 3:30, and I know that some of you have questions. I'm looking around to see if the audio person is around, because I would have a mic. Yes, is there a mic I can? Awesome, thank you. And just if you want to raise your hand, I'll bring you the mic if you have a question.
Don't take this wrong. I support all these things. And in fact, as I explained to Naomi back 35 years ago, I built one of the most efficient houses at that time, probably garbage now, in Amherst, Mass. Groundwater, linked heat pump, solar, hot water, passive design, all that. But as Tony knows, I'm somewhat familiar with operation of the electric grid in New England and the electricity market. And unknown to a lot of people probably is that there's more solar in New England, PV solar, than there is wind. It's about 1,100 last I knew. And there's a big difference between the wind and the solar. The wind comes in large chunks, it's metered, it's telemetered into the control center, so the people who are operating the grid know what it's doing. The solar, on the other hand, comes in little bitty pieces, except for one 15 megawatt field down off of the Mass Turnpike near mile 71 if you're ever driving along there. That one's telemetered in, but all the rest isn't. So when the guys who are operating the system are trying to forecast the load for tomorrow, they have not yet developed the sophistication to forecast where the sun will be shining versus where the clouds will be. And that makes operations a little more challenging. If 1,100 megawatts disappears and then comes back and disappears, comes back, 70% of that solar, I think, is in Massachusetts. So my question to Fortunat and maybe Tony and anybody else is, has any research been done on using these smart meters and all that to actually feed the output of the solar panels back to the distribution company, which could feed it back to the control centers, so the guy trying to keep a balance between load and generation has some idea of what's going on?
Seems to me with the meteorologists we have out there. We should be able to.
Yeah, so I mean, like you said, this is so it's an existing challenge, but not an insurmountable challenge. And there are lots of places around the world with much deeper renewables penetration than we have in New England, who have a functional and balanced grid. So the larger solar plants, lots of the solar being built in southern New England are relatively large solar plants, utility scale solar plants, and those are sort of communicating with central control rooms at ISO. The rooftop customer-sited solar generally is not. And up until, I don't know, I want to say it's 18 months ago or so, the ISO did not even consider distributed solar in their long-range transmission planning. They ignored the fact that thousands and thousands of people are putting solar on the roof of their homes and businesses and said, we assume it's going to have no effect at all on demand and demand timing. Now, as of, I don't know, I think it's about 2 years ago, there are working groups at ISO New England who are looking at that question exactly. And, while it's awfully hard to predict, for example, what exactly number 3 principal drive is going to be exporting at any given time, that's not all that important. It's just like I have no idea how much electricity your house is going to be using over at any given time. What we care about is the sort of statistical sum, right? And so that is doable with, like you said, weather predictions and historical data and forecasting. And Germany and Hawaii and Denmark are way farther down this line, and California ISO, than we are in New England.
Another question? I feel like I'm on a game show.
What prize do I get?
I wish I had one.
2 questions. What keeps customers from converting to solar and other renewables? And the other question is why, if C&P's in the monopoly business, why wouldn't it just convert to these alternatives? Why doesn't it transition to it? It knows that's the demise of C&P.
So what keeps customers from converting to solar? Nothing. Everybody's doing it. Historically, so it's some combination of education. We do an awful lot of educating of customers of what the options are, and I think Claudette does the same thing. People don't even know, propane is an option or CNG is an option in some places, and the same is true for solar in Maine in particular. And then, historically, and still somewhat today, although a lot less, the capital cost is a hurdle for people. People are used to paying for their energy as they use it, right? So you essentially, you rent your energy, right? Because you pay on a monthly basis. And when you buy a solar system, you're sort of going from being a renter to being an owner. And so you have to change the way you conceive of the way you pay for energy and think of it as a capital investment as opposed to an operating cost. That can be solved either by changing people's mindsets or more likely by bringing financing solutions for people so that you buy a solar system and you pay for it the same way you pay for your electric bill, which is increasingly popular either in a loan or a lease program for solar. As for why CMP doesn't convert to become a solar company, well, you can ask CMP, but I think part of it is that they don't produce energy, right? In Maine, we're a deregulated utility state. The utilities just own poles and wires. They don't own power plants anymore. They're not allowed to own power plants anymore. And that is actually, sometimes that's really good because at least on the energy generation side, we have sort of a semi-free market. But sometimes it's bad because that's all they know how to do now is build poles and wires.
If I could comment on that. Some of you may remember when John Rowe was president of Sunlight Power Company. If you don't, I do. In any event, John made the point that owning generation is risky because it's hard work and somebody may come along and invent a kind of generation that puts you out of business. Owning poles and wires on which you earn 12% every year, whether they're used or not, is a great business. And that's the business the utilities prefer. And that's not going to change. So to put in solar requires now forethought. It requires contacting Fortunat or maybe some others, but it requires your desire. And a lot of people are doing it even though it's a long payback in their minds because they know it's the right thing to do to fight climate change. And I see that happening around New England by the tens of thousands of people, and it's going to increase dramatically. But the other problem is this, and it's a much more serious matter. We don't give solar the price benefit that it deserves. When New England gets hot in the summertime, our peak is 25% composed of air conditioning. Now, what time of day does that happen? 10 o'clock in the morning? No. It tends to happen from 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 6 or 7. Well, that's when solar in the summer is the most effective. So solar is literally an antidote to the effect of the sun heating where we live and work. And that benefit is substantial, and we need to make sure solar is paid that. It isn't just the ability to offset your bill, it's what you're conferring on society. And Fortunat and I are involved in a few proceedings where we're trying to make sure that happens. And most of all, we're trying to make sure that there's not discrimination against people who install solar and other renewables in their homes and businesses and net their output against their bill. That system exists in 43 states, and there have been efforts to take it away, and we need to fight those.
Thanks. Hey, I've got a quick question. I hear a lot when we're talking about natural gas, you hear this bridge comment used. And when you're talking about connecting...
It wants to turn itself off by now. Maybe, I think if you stay away from that button.
Connecting the pipeline to this facility, that's sort of a bridge. And the tendency, I think, for infrastructure, once installed, it continues to be used. So if we're talking about getting off natural gas and onto renewables sooner, with the garbage in the basement, the fossil fuels that are being used today, the tendency is to stay on that. So I guess thinking about how the revolutionary idea you're talking about would be, should we be diversifying the fuel used for power supply? So use that natural gas to generate electricity, and so move toward the heat pumps, the electric cars, and then allow that to be the diversity in the energy mix versus building more infrastructure, pumping it into the home to use different fuel supply types. I just thought of that when we were talking about this connection to the building.
Andy Grove, who was one of the founders of Intel, is obviously related to you because he had the same idea. He said, he published an article in a periodical that said, I don't know anything about energy, he said, but I can drive and I see service stations and power lines all along the roads. So why don't we use the electric grid to move to renewables and move to electric cars? And that was 6 or 8 years ago, and obviously he wasn't the first person to think of that. The answer is we need to do both, where it's economically efficient to interconnect this huge complex with gas, where it's already on propane. That probably makes sense. But when the next one is built, John will consider whether to go with gas based on its proximity, or to go with heat pumps. Both require more natural gas.
Right, just to add to that, when Tony was talking previously about adding natural gas capacity, he's talking mostly about the large pipelines that bring it to the region, not the distribution pipelines. One of the challenges in Maine is, we're so rural, the vast majority of Maine will never be served by natural gas infrastructure. And our feeling, like Tony's and like yours, is the more we can electrify our lives, electricity is not an energy source, it's an energy vector, right? So the more we can electrify our lives, our transportation, our space conditioning, that then enables the wholesale transition to renewables, which is inevitable and necessary. I think Tony and I probably disagree on how big of a bridge we need to build out of natural gas, but sort of directionally, I think we see the same thing.
So Tony, to be clear, what you're talking about is bringing the capacity to things like big manufacturers and to power plants. You're not talking about every home in Maine having access to a natural gas line.
No, Fortunat is right. That would be imprudent. But it's a moot point when you can't get the gas from the Marcellus to Maine. There was gas in Atlantic Canada offshore. It's depleted now. The Marcellus gas and the Utica gas below it will last 200 years at current usage. Let's be conservative. Oh, it'll only last 100, right? It's there. It is a bridge. I don't believe we'll rely on gas any longer than we have to, just as we are shutting down nuclear plants far before we thought we would. We are not, who here, I can't even mention the old style devices we used to have in our homes, the things that ran tapes and discs and so on. Right? We discard technology like girlfriends in high school. I mean, it's just, we don't get married to technology.
So could I just add,
Yes.
so just when we think about portability and infrastructure and the cost of infrastructure and committing to it or not, I would just offer up that propane is here today, it is gas, and it actually has movable infrastructure that you can add and subtract anytime you like, and in most cases, that's supported by private industry. We pay for those tanks.
Hi, Jeff Packard here. First,
Oh, no.
I promise I didn't touch the button.
I saw you did it.
First, thank you for being here. This is very informative. Maybe I'll just talk loudly. So, interesting point on the technology, Tony. One thing that people really do not change. One thing people really do not change very frequently is the boiler in their basement. I mean, I've been in buildings where you have boilers that literally were bricked around and they're still operational. And with natural gas, a lot of people are just taking the pipe and plumbing it into there, and you have a system that's maybe 30% efficient operating on natural gas. Now, that's not very good. That leads into kind of another comment, which is what Naomi was talking about with passive house. On the thermal side, we use 90% less energy
for heating, right? And it's like
75% less total energy. Now, if we just had all passive houses, we wouldn't need any more pipelines, we wouldn't need any of that additional infrastructure because we just wouldn't have the demand for it. So I'd be curious how much concentrated effort there has been on some of these larger consumers like hospitals, like hotels, schools, campuses, things of that nature, to really go in and say, look, maybe we don't need to build another pipeline. Maybe what we need to do is take that old 30, 60-year-old piece of equipment that's literally sucking down gas as fast as it possibly can and replace it with something that's more efficient, where we do a system and we can see a 30% reduction in propane consumption, right? That's a real impact. When you're talking about something that uses 250,000 gallons, 500,000 gallons, that's a significant chunk, and that's one project.
Jeffrey, you say we do a system. Who do you work with?
My company is called Aladdin. We do distributed generation projects, and so hotels primarily. But looking at the consumption is tremendous. And the other thing I think that should be noted is that most of the conversation is kind of centered around electricity, and yet we have some of the lowest electricity costs in New England from the data that I've seen, and in some cases in the United States. And yet we still use, as Claudette mentioned, 65% oil. Oil is the most expensive, most of the time, the most expensive fuel that can be used for heating. So it seems like we should be focusing a tremendous amount of our effort on heating instead of on electricity. And so that's something that I don't know if there's anything that you guys could do to perhaps align that focus a little bit more. But I think it's something that is especially necessary in Maine, where it's very cold. We have a lot of oil, which means we have a very expensive fuel that we're using to heat. It seems like something we should do.
So first of all, as far as the cost of oil, actually right now it's not very expensive, relatively. And interestingly, as I hear some of the conversation, this sort of goes back to picking winners and losers and which choice did you make and should we make huge investments, et cetera. I mean, the last 5 years, if you looked at commodity costs across all commodities, electricity, oil, propane, natural gas, they are all over the place with wild swings both ways. So I would just say I would caution against picking winners and losers, and that's why I go back to diversification of what your energy is, or efficiency, because I couldn't agree more that the cheapest gallon that you use is the one you don't burn, or the cheapest electricity kilowatt that you use is the one you don't use. I'd go back to that. And so I lost track of what you were saying, Jeff.
There's a whole bunch of stuff.
Yes.
I think efficiency is really.
Agreed. I couldn't agree more.
I think we have time for another question. One more question. Oh gosh. Oh, some guidance from the organizers here. How many should I take? Here you go, Robert. I'll start with you. And apparently it's not the button, it's interference in the room. So.
My name is Robert Wagner. I've been involved in the energy and transportation issues for 20 or 25 years. I'm a little bit concerned about what the utilities problems are because, not that I'm a utility stock owner, but because our solar peaks don't always match the demand load. Yes, the summer peak may come pretty close, but right now, on a sunny day like it was when we walked in here, our solar systems are producing huge amounts of power. And I think the demand must be extremely low because people have their windows open, they're not really heating or cooling. And so energy storage becomes a very important thing, and you're paying, the utility obviously has to manage that, so there's the managing cost. And the need perhaps for more solar storage like hydro that can presumably come on fairly quickly if it's on spinning reserve. And so I'm concerned about that, and I really want to make sure that we have a balanced system that doesn't increase the capacity where it isn't really needed.
So I totally agree with you that at some point when intermittent resources like solar and wind make up a very large fraction of the base load, that you need to add things like storage and demand response to the system beyond what we have. I would disagree with the premise that the utilities are necessarily the best people to do that. And it's not because I dislike the utilities. I just think, like as what people here said, most of our country believes that free market solutions are better solutions. Appropriately regulated free market solutions are better solutions. So, for example, we can install, and we do install in customers' basements, small battery-based energy systems that serve the same function as the generators that John is installing here for residents at OceanView. So. These are still relatively new to the market. We don't do a lot of these, but in another decade, when we're including, a 10 kilowatt hour battery with every solar system, primarily to provide backup power in case of power outages, why wouldn't we also use that energy storage to perform a grid function to buffer the peaks and valleys of distributed renewables? We can, but only if the grid is smart enough to send appropriate pricing signals to the end user. Right today, I have no incentive to store my solar energy for later in the day if the peak is later in the day, because I don't pay variable pricing and the utility doesn't pass those costs through to me. So what we need is a much smarter, more digital grid. And then all those solutions fall out, and there are lots of solutions that are cheaper than battery and pump storage. There's solutions like turning my water heater off this afternoon. I don't even have a water heater, I'm not even home, right? And so that's what I talk about when I talk about sort of a regulatory structure that enables a whole host of solutions that better meet customer needs at lower total cost.
Is there government incentive to just doing the simplest thing by new construction being done in a way that is not going to require all this complicated stuff?
Well, we need a statewide building code. That's the first thing. Florida has one. We don't. Imagine that. In Florida, you have to be licensed to be a contractor. I can be a contractor, and that would be a disaster. We could clean our act up quite a bit and achieve some of the things that passivhaus advocates, and perhaps a lot more. I just want to add something to what was said earlier, if I may. The 75%, 74% of the energy that is used in Maine homes and businesses is renewable energy, because we have so much more generation than we have demand. You could just take all the renewables and say they're allocated to our demand, and we'll send the non-renewable out of state. You can't actually do that on the grid, but the point is, you didn't know that we have the ability to function as a society for energy consumption in our homes and businesses, for electricity, almost 3/4 on renewable energy. That's how close we are to being able to run our automobiles on electricity taken from the same grid. But people our decision makers don't realize that. We are very close to being able to take these enormous leaps and fit all these various sources into a system that basically uses the electric grid and our roads and our transportation systems to sustain ourselves as we improve. The challenge is to make the decision. I often say that the energy policy of New England is to debate energy policy. We need to make some decisions.
That's good for the lawyers, isn't it?
Apparently it is good for lawyers. I can't complain.
So we're going to take one more question. I saw you had your hand up, Bruce. And then we're going to invite people to visit the panelists at their displays after that. So one more question before the audience.
Okay, I heard earlier you mentioned 3 major sources of renewable energy with solar, wind, and water. Nobody's mentioned biofuels, and there was a big article in the paper last week about the future of biofuels. Would you comment on that? Is that a viable source of renewable energy?
Tony might have a strong opinion about this too, but the way we burn biofuels for electricity today in Maine, I think is not really a viable source of energy. It's low efficiency and it's dirty. And it's outdated. I think biofuels probably do have a role in sort of a totally renewable world, but typically they're used most efficiently in combined heat and power applications. When you can serve both a thermal load and electric load with the same wood chip, you can go a lot farther with the same wood chip, and you can actually manage the forest in a sustainable way and create, secondary markets for the pulp and paper industry, which is important sort of to the local economy here in Maine. But just chipping up trees to make electricity doesn't feel like a viable part of the long-term energy mix, in my opinion.
Okay.
I was just going to say, if you're speaking about biofuels for electricity generation, there's also biofuels, there's liquid biofuels, ultra low sulfur heating oil. There's actually a new mandate that says that as of 2018, all across New England, that will be the case for everyone. In many cases, there's a lot of bio being blended into the heating oil that we get today. But if that's what you're speaking to, yes, that's coming. And there is actually some interesting innovation going on about wood to liquid biofuels. Excited about that. Love to see more of that. Because we have a huge liquid infrastructure. That's the last thing I would say. I mean, we are built around a liquid infrastructure today.
Okay, great. Thank you guys, and thank the panelists.